Grow Your Own High Elevation Gardening series. Our presentation that we're kicking off our season with is on germinating seeds and transplanting. I am a presenter who's been with the Grow Your Own series for the past couple years. I am no longer representing any of the great organizations that are bringing these workshops to you, but just want to take a second to mention each of them. Slow Food Lake Tahoe, the UCCE Master Gardeners of Lake Tahoe, and the UC Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center put a lot of work into bringing these workshops to you, each of the last many years in person, but for the last 2 years virtually. So we're excited to get to continue this workshop series. And we're really excited for this workshop this evening because we have the Desert Farming Initiative presenting on this topic this evening, and they have actually been a major supplier of a lot of our starter plants for our workshops over the past couple years. We have a really, really wonderful lineup of workshops this season for you all. A lot of new things and some things that we've covered in the past as well. So like I said, we'll have the germinating and transplanting tonight. And then we'll also cover mushrooms, gardening 101 and fertilizers, beans and peas, starting those from seeds. We're gonna have our favorite leafy greens presenter, Allison Toy, coming back to talk about kale and lettuce and more, as well as potatoes and sunchoke, squash, tomatoes, and herbs. As you all can see from this table of a lot of dates, we have virtual presentations that are going to be on Wednesdays at 6 p.m. now. And you can register for those on the Slow Food Lake Tahoe events webpage that is linked at the top here, just how you registered for this workshop this evening. However, in addition to having virtual presentations this year and the starter plants available with specific workshops, we'll actually be doing some in-person workshops as well at the Slow Food Garden in Truckee, if you are able to join us. And so that's what that third column shows us, which is a really exciting addition, a good way to come out and connect with the community and then practice your gardening skills and actually see some of those things in action. Briefly going to go through a couple Zoom tools for you to make your viewing experience great this evening. In this upper right-hand corner, you can change your view. If you're seeing a lot of boxes on your screen and just want to see the presenter as they're speaking, you can change your view into speaker view there. Additionally, we'll be hosting a question and answer session at the end of our workshop. So if you click on that chat box along the bottom of your screen, where you can address your questions to, if you scroll through the names that are available and you actually click questions to Mary Wall, who is the UCCE Master Gardeners of Lake Tahoe Program Coordinator, she'll be helping facilitate that question and answer session later in our workshop. Additionally, we'll be turning on a live transcript function so that we can make this workshop as accessible to everyone as possible. So if you do want to leave that live transcript option on, you can turn that on and off with that live transcript button there. But no one wants to hear too much about those logistics, so we're going to get back into our presentation for this evening. As I mentioned, we have two presenters this evening from the Desert Farming Initiative, which is a part of the University of Nevada, Reno. Our two presenters this evening are Anna Miller and Tanner Petrilla. Anna is a Reno native and loves the community as much as she loves the surrounding Sierra Nevada mountains and the Great Basin Desert. She graduated from UNR in the spring of 2019, where she studied eco-hydrology and Spanish and was involved in numerous campus organizations. Anna has been involved with water resource monitoring programs on multiple national forests and has diverse experience in education, from instructing elementary students in environmental science in the field to teaching English classes in Spain. So fun. While a student, she co-founded the UNR chapter of the Soil and Water Conservation Society and participated in the 2018 conference regarding soil health in California's agricultural systems. She expanded her experience with farming through a year-long AmeriCorps service at the Desert Farming Initiative and is enthusiastic to combine her passions for people and the environment in her new role as DFI's Education Program Coordinator. Anna's going to be taking us through the beginning of our presentation, and then Tanner is going to be doing some hands-on demonstrations. And Tanner oversees day-to-day operations of the farm and greenhouse propagation at DFI. Tanner served as an AmeriCorps member as well with DFI as the farm and garden assistant and volunteer leader. And upon completing his service, he continued on in a leadership role with DFI. He studied nutrition at Truckee Meadows Community College and is in his 5th year working in the field of organic vegetable farming. His passion for soil health, community, and the epic Sierra Nevada mountains constantly overflows into his daily work. He founded the first Young Farmers Coalition chapter in Nevada and is currently president of the organization. We're really excited to have both of these wonderful presenters here with us this evening, and I am going to turn it over to them to get us going.
Great. Thank you so much, Anne, for that introduction, and thank you all for being here. So I'm Anna Miller. Thank you so much for the introduction. And I'd just like to start out by introducing you all to the Desert Farming Initiative, giving you an idea of what the initiative is about and what we do. So some context before Tanner presents on propagation. So a general outline for our presentation today is I'll be providing that introduction and then be passing it over to Tanner, who will talk through choosing seeds, the equipment and methods that we use and that home gardeners can use for propagation, and then go into plants of particular interest to this group, tips and tricks around those plants in particular. And we'll leave plenty of time at the end for questions that we'll be receiving throughout in the chat. Next slide. So the Desert Farming Initiative was founded in 2013 as a collaborative project between the UNR College of Business and the College of Agriculture, Biotechnology, and Natural Resources, and also the University of Nevada Cooperative Extension. Our mission is to advance climate smart farming and food sovereignty in the region, which we accomplish through demonstration, education, outreach, and research. To go into some of the aspects of education and outreach that we provide, part of that is providing educational opportunities for you and our students, which we do through employment, internships for credits, or for pay. We do tours for UNR classes. A UNR garden club has their garden at our facilities, and we engage students through volunteer events. We provide educational services for and outreach to growers. So that looks like a climate smart agricultural resources online, developing a Nevada farm network, and we do outreach and support around food safety. We also do outreach regarding food sovereignty and security in the region. So right now we're engaged in SNAP Ed work at farmers markets, a tribal food sovereignty project looking at traditional foods for this region, and starting to work on a beginning farmer rancher apprenticeship program. We also provide the broader community with educational opportunities in the form of volunteer events, workshops, socials, and tours. Obviously, a big part of what we do is the farm itself and our farm production, which I've divided here into the production of organic fruit and vegetables. And then also important to this presentation is our organic plant nursery program. So in terms of the fruit and vegetable production, each year we're putting out tens of thousands of pounds of produce. Historically, our top crops have been kale, tomatoes, lettuce, and carrots. And about 60% of that produce is directed to wholesale markets, which importantly for us includes food pantries. And about 30% of it is going to retail markets. So at our farm stand, at farmers markets that's pictured. We also have a CCOF certified organic plant nursery program. We propagate plants both for our own farming operation, about 50% of the plants, and the other 50% are going to wholesale customers and retail. So each year we're putting over 1,000 trays out, over 120,000 plants coming out of our greenhouse. Another aspect of what we're doing at DFI is research, both formal and informal. One of the formal research projects we have going right now is around melon varieties. And we are also managing the Jessica Younger Dickens Memorial and Research Orchard, doing research on cider apples. We also do a lot of demonstration of agricultural practices, trialing new things and treating that as anecdotal research projects that we're able to share with the farming community. So this year, we're really looking into conservation agricultural practices, including soil health, cover cropping, annual and perennial insectaries, and permaculture. We're also exploring some methods of composting, irrigation water monitoring, tomato grafting, and trialing some sustainable potting mixes. So people are always curious to know who all makes up our team at DFI. We have 3 faculty, myself and Tanner, and our director is Jill Moe. Then at any given time, obviously we're a very seasonal operation. We employ between 1 and 4 student employees, 1 and 3 AmeriCorps members, varying number of academic student internships, paid student interns. And then we are very fortunate to have the great engagement of some long-term work trade volunteers when we might have up to 10 in peak season. So with that, I will pass it over to Tanner to get into the topic of the day, plant propagation.
Thanks so much, Anna. So plant propagation. We'll talk about choosing seeds, propagation equipment and methods, and propagating plants of interest today. I just want to start off by saying how grateful I am and all of us at DFI are to share our experience in propagating plants with y'all. And we have a lot of really interesting stuff to me and hopefully to you too to go over today. So we'll just jump right into it. Choosing seeds, collecting and saving seeds. We encourage seed saving to anybody. It's an amazing practice. It's how we can have a safe and secure food system. We don't seed save that much at DFI. We would like to progress more into seed saving, but currently we'll save our garlic seeds. We'll save varieties of native seeds, and I've done some passive seed saving where we'll let a plant go to flower, and then basically we've covered it up with compost and planted the next succession. So I've let cilantro go to flower, and then we put about a ½ inch of compost for better or worse, and then planted kale into the bed. And it's all really good success, really healthy cilantro plants, and also a good companion with kale. Choosing seeds, seed sources. So when you're choosing your seeds, important to consider whether you're buying organic or non-organic seeds. If you are saving seeds, then you can know if you're doing organic practices or not. We're certified organic through the CCOF at DFI. So we try our best always to buy organic seeds. If we don't buy organic, it would be because of a potential high cost for a seed. The availability of an organic seed might not be there, or the seed could just be more feasible in a non-organic sense. It's important to consider the origin of the seeds you're purchasing. Where are the seeds coming from? Is it a similar bioregion to where you're planning to grow, or are the seeds from an area that's completely different? That will definitely determine the level of success. Are the seeds you're purchasing open pollinated? Have they been pollinated by insects and wild insects and wind, or have they been hybridized, so they've been controlled, bred together? It depends on what your goal is. If you are striving to have a garden that's going to regenerate year after year and generally adapt plants, I would recommend open pollinated plants. And if you are looking for the most vigorous plants, maybe some disease resistance or high yields for some reason, then hybrid seeds is a great way to go for that moment. The hybrid seeds are less predictable when if you save seeds from a hybrid plant, they might be the one variety or the other. So it's like a pairing of two. Seed viability is really, really important when you're in production like we are at DFI. We check the seed packets, and depending on the seed germination percentage, will determine how much we need to overseed. If you're saving seeds, sometimes you won't know how well your seeds will germinate, and you'll just have to learn that over time. Sometimes getting seeds from a reputable seed source can be really useful. Have the seeds been tested for disease and contamination? So oftentimes seed companies like Johnny's or High Mowing, they're pretty reliable in the sense that they'll offer a guarantee that if the seeds don't germinate for some reason, they'll offer a refund or to resupply those seeds. It's important to consider if there's weeds or invasive seeds in the seed mix, and that's all stuff that you can run past to the seed company just to make sure that you're getting quality. And that's a nice part about the purchasing seeds from the seed industry. As far as seed storage goes, it's best to store seeds in a refrigerator or a dark, cool, and dry place. Seed viability will decrease over time especially if they're stored in a moist environment, or if they're exposed to direct sunlight. That really shortens the lifespan of a seed. Treated seeds can aid in the seed's germination. They can increase the seed's accuracy, like over here in the photo on the right, we have pelleted lettuce seeds. So that helps us to sow them more accurately. And it can also help prevent disease in some cases. Some examples for us at DFI is a primed rosemary seed that we've used to have better germination. A coated carrot seed helps with sowing in the seeder. And a pelleted lettuce seed, like I mentioned, will really help with the vacuum seeder in the lettuce. So we'll talk more about that later. Some seed treatments are allowed under organic certification, and many treated seeds you can almost guarantee are not going to be organic. Pre-treatment of seeds. We often treat perennial and native seeds. We'll soak them, we'll subject them to boiling water, we'll soak them in bleach or vinegar, or we'll wet or cold stratify these seeds. So just kind of trying to mimic nature and how nature would potentially overwinter a seed to prepare it to germinate. We typically don't pre-treat our annual vegetable seeds, except for the exception of this year. We'll try pre-treating our melon seeds because we've had disease issues. We'll talk about our propagation equipment next. We'll go over irrigation, germination chamber or humidity dome, heat mat and thermostat, heating and cooling equipment in the greenhouse, soil mixing equipment, vacuum seeder, trays and pots, and labels. It's a lot, but it's good stuff. Propagation equipment. As far as irrigation goes, a question to ask yourself, and I'll try to relate our presentation to our DFI production, but also a home grower scenario. So how will you water? We at DFI use a hose and watering wand with the nozzle. I really like this method because it provides a really consistent stream of water that's gentle on the plants. So baby plants need a really gentle watering. An option for at home is a watering can or a spray bottle could be sufficient, depending on the size of your operation or the size of your living room. Capillary mats or bottom watering can be a reasonable option, but if you're using potting mixes that are really strong in nutrients, it can propagate algae and disease pretty easily. Or automated overhead options, totally amazing ways to optimize. I prefer to water by hand because of the connection that I have, but definitely considering automation for kind of the really busy times. When you're thinking about irrigation, something to consider is the sun and lighting, the shade possibilities, and air temperatures and movement. Just how fast and readily are these soil cells going to dry out? How often do I need to water? Propagation equipment, our germination chamber can also be substituted for humidity dome. So the germination chamber is this big box over here. It's a optimal germination space for germinating many plants that love a very humid environment, most annual vegetables, and a warm environment. So we can set the temperature over here between 50 to probably about 85 degrees. We typically keep our germ chamber around 80 degrees. A good substitute for the home grower is a humidity dome. That's a great way to control the humidity. We'll just try to keep it as high as we can. I checked the humidity in our germ chamber the other day, and it was about 94%. So it's almost 100% humidity. It's a perfect environment for annual vegetables to germinate. We love our germ chamber for tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, brassicas, the kale family, the cucurbits, cucumber, melon family, and others that love that warm and humid environment. Uh, it's okay for beets and chard, and I won't put lettuce or spinach in a germ chamber. So that could be possible where you wouldn't want to put lettuce or spinach in a humidity dome too. They seem to do just fine on the table in a relative ambient temperature. Heat mats and thermostat. This is something that whether the seeds germinate in the germ chamber or not, the trays will always go onto a heat mat with a thermostat for some time. Typically, we don't get 100% germination in the germ chamber. So when the seeds are begun sprouting, we know that they've generally all started sprouting in some way, but they may not be showing germination. We'll put the trays onto a heat mat. The thermostat is really helpful because it allows us to control the germination temperature. So right here is a germination guide. I pulled this off of Johnny's website, and this is telling us that this bean right here will germinate ideally at 86 degrees Fahrenheit. So we would want to set our heat mat to about 86 for this seed. If you have lots of different varieties, it's kind of good to find that happy medium space. So find what variety you can find, like maybe 75 degrees would be a good fit for the majority of your plants. If you don't have a thermostat, it should be okay, but you may have to water more often or less often depending on how warm your heat mat is. Depending on the sun or light exposure, you may have to water more often as well. And if you're going out of town, the thermostat's very nice because you could turn the temperature very low, but not too low so that they don't dry it off too often. We typically water our heat mat trays 1, 2, maybe 3 times in the summer when it's really hot, but 1 to 2 times a day for sure. Keep the trays really moist because the heat mats are increasing that evapotranspiration. Heating and cooling within our greenhouse, we use an evaporative cooler, extraction fans, a roof vent, and a heater to maintain conditions. So maybe in a living room or a garage, all these things are important to consider. How can you keep the environment between 50 to 85 degrees? Something really kind of gentle for a baby plant. So our evaporative cooler in the greenhouse is functioning similar to a swamp cooler. It's basically pulling cool air from outside into the greenhouse. Then these extraction fans over here on the right, they'll actually turn on and blow the cool air. They'll pull the cool air through the greenhouse. So it's using that positive pressure to pull that air through the house. And that's kind of the main cooling system for us in the summertime. The roof vent is actually not ideal as a big cooling method because if we open the vent, it's actually reducing the amount of pressure in our greenhouse. So I'll only open the vent on really, really hot days when there's extreme greenhouse effect happening in the house. We have 2 large heaters. I can't remember the heat that's moving through them, but the 2 large heaters will heat our house. Anytime it goes below 50 degrees, they'll kick on. Soil mixing. We mix our soil by hand at DFI. There's some benefits to it. You just get to be connected with that whole process, making sure that everything's mixed well. There's other alternatives that can save your back. Like many people will repurpose a cement mixer. Walker Basin Conservancy has a beautiful soil mixer that you can tell that they really enjoy not having to mix their soil by hand. But with us at DFI, the hand mixing works great, and it's great exercise. It's a good 15-20 minutes of cardio. We'll talk more about our soil mix, our soil potting mix recipe later on. Vacuum seeder. So this is something that is just key for us in production vegetables in the greenhouse. You can see over here we have our seeds. It's pretty loud. It's like the sound of a shop vac. The vacuum seeder adds efficiency and accuracy to our large scale production. We could seed about 40 trays in 1 hour, and we'll talk more about what is a tray in a little bit. We'll put the seeds onto the vacuum seeder, kick it on, and then they'll basically get sucked into the corresponding holes within the seeder. And then once we turn the seeder over, we'll put it over the tray and push a button, and that basically turns the vacuum function off, and therefore letting the seeds fall into the tray. Usually in the perfect alignment for the tray. So the vacuum seeder is essential for production vegetables. It could be nice for the home grower too. Trays and pots. So we use a varying degree of sizes for trays and pots. we'll use 10-20 flats for onions, 128s for anything that we're growing for about 4 to 6 weeks, 72 cell trays for things that are about 4 to 6 or 7 weeks. It gives us more time, larger cells. 18 cell flats or 3-inch pots is what we will pot up most things into. We typically don't seed into 3-inch pots because of space, really just a space requirement. So we'll seed many things into 128s, then transplant them later. And we'll talk about that as we move on. So you can see that all these trays are plastic. We don't prefer to use plastic here at DFI. We're really mindful of our plastic consumption, but nonetheless, the plastic trays add efficiency. If you're looking for environmentally friendly options, which I would highly recommend for the home grower, there's compostable or paper pots. We're using some cow pots for our plant sale plants this year. You could use homemade wooden trays or even baking trays would be fine. And soil blocks, I would just recommend Googling soil blocks or looking up Johnny's website. It's a great way to make cells essentially without using any plastic, just molding the soil, and it stays. So soil blocks is a really ideal solution for the home grower and in commercial effects as well. We just haven't had a chance. I haven't had the chance to practice with soil blocking quite yet. Labels. Labels are essential. They're really helpful for organization and records. Our labels, we always include the variety of plant, the date, and the customer name if we're seeding for a customer. These are so essential because when you go to plant the plant, you might want to know, or you might get confused. It's so easy to lose track when the seeds are in the soil, lose track of what a tray is. So I would highly recommend always label any new seeds that you're putting in a tray. Oops. Okay, so now we'll talk about propagation methods. We'll talk about our DFI potting mix alternatives, filling trays, seeding trays, maximizing space, watering, and monitoring moisture, monitoring for pests and disease, and timing. And I saw a question come in. We'll get to questions at the end. So I see it, and we'll hopefully address it at the end. Just a note, disease and pests impacts are always reduced when the plants aren't stressed. So having a really easy environment and having really good timing and just loving and caring for our plants is really going to reduce disease and pest issues. I've always heard the best fertilizer is the farmer's footprint. Our propagation method, we'll talk about our DFI potting mix. Here's our DFI potting mix. We'll measure it in 5-gallon buckets, and we use all OMRI approved for organic production materials. So typically we'll put about 6 buckets of peat moss, and we'll sift the peat moss through a 1/2-inch screen. We'll put 3 buckets of perlite, no need to sift, 2 buckets of vermiculite, also no sifting involved, and 1 bucket of compost. We will sift it, and we include compost that we made in-house. It's certified organic compost that we make from our vegetable production, so kind of a regenerative aspect and a biological inoculant with that compost. Not all composts are created equal, so you really have to consider and maybe consider testing the compost that you made. We do our very, very best to ensure that no pathogens make it into our compost by pertaining to organic regulations. So that's the bulk of our potting mix. Then these nutrients is what supplements the plants from a period of 4 to 6 weeks of growth. Kelp meal, bone meal, blood meal, and feather meal. So a lot of these are byproducts of just worldwide production of animals, and kelp is a very abundant resource. We just found that this mix works. So there is more environmentally friendly options, more sustainable options, and let's talk about that next. So some potting mix alternatives to consider. Cocoa coir is an amazing alternative to peat moss. It's more environmentally stable. It's just comes from the husks of coconut. It's a slightly higher pH, and it has slightly less moisture retention. So we've tried planting plants with cocoa coir as the medium, and essentially they just dry out a little bit faster, so we'll have to water them more. It's no big deal. It's just a little harder to work with than peat moss, and that higher pH kind of slightly alters the plant, but not much. It's negligible. I would recommend it. Well composted wood chips and leaves could be a really great solution to using outsourced cocoa coir or peat moss. It's readily available to get wood chips. Then in about 2 years, if you add water and maybe add some turning to these piles of just wood chips and water, they're going to break down into an amazing potting mix medium. But you'll have to be patient. It takes a couple of years for wood to really break down. Some of the alternatives to the nutrients, you could potentially use alfalfa meal and substitute for feather meal. Crab or oyster shells, not necessarily vegan, but those could be a substitute for bone meal, that calcium supplement. Azomite or rock dust can be a great fungal food and supplement of minerals, not micro minerals, but just minerals. Worm castings can provide incredible results. And you could also try just adding less nutrients, making a really simple potting mix and supplementing with Fizz hydrolysate or compost tea as you go. If you ever catch me around town, we can nerd out and talk about compost tea for hours. When we're filling trays over here at DFI, we do our best to bulk task, and we'll want to fill maybe 25, 40 trays at once. So you can see our process here. When we're filling a tray, we'll make sure that they're not too packed and not too loose. So I like to describe the way a tray feels when it's packed is that it's like a brand new sponge, kind of like those grocery store sponges that's slightly moist. And we will fill our trays once, then we'll take an existing tray, we'll lift it up, and we'll place the one tray on top. We'll stack a tray on top of each other and kind of press down. Then after that, we'll add a whole nother layer of soil, and then we'll kind of pat that soil in. And usually that will create a really nice tray, not too tight, not too loose. Seeding trays. So we talked about vacuum seeding already. Vacuum seeding will pretty much seed any trays that require 1 to 2 seeds per cell: chard, kale, tomatoes, peppers, really anything. We'll use a vacuum seeder for efficiency. We'll hand seed uniquely shaped seeds. We'll hand seed bunching onions when we want 6 seeds per cell, so that each cell equals 1 bunch of onions. And also sometimes we'll hand seed trays when we have multiple varieties per tray. Typically at DFI, since our production is so large, we'll always do an entire tray's worth of one variety. That really saves confusion and saves on labels too. But definitely hand seeding is really practical for having many varieties in one tray. And as I mentioned, with the germination percentage, we always overseed by about 20%, depending on the company's germination rate. But just to be safe, we'll always go with 20%. Sometimes a seed packet that says 100% germination will germinate 50%, and just have to kind of plan to always overseed. So I would highly recommend overseeding what you need, and you can always share with your neighbors or friends garden friends afterwards. We try to maximize space here at DFI. So we have a pretty large greenhouse. There's like 30 something tables in there, but it'll totally fill up by May or June. So potting up, we'll talk about, there's some kind of wordiness here, but potting up plants is when we take a small plug, a small cell, a plant that's in a small cell, and we'll pot it up into a larger pot. The pro of starting potting up a plant is that it saves space initially. So it can fit 128 plants in a 128 tray, and that's about 6 or 7 times larger when you use 3-inch pots, 18 cell pots. So when you pot a plant, it allows for bigger plants to be planted in the garden. That's super relevant for anybody growing in Tahoe, because we have a pretty short season. It's we want to get the plants growing before that last frost, and potting up plants can provide a season extension. And it also offers an earlier harvest time. So if you grow tomatoes nice and huge, they could practically be fruiting by the time you plant them outside. And potting up plants can reduce weed competition. So the con of transplanting is that it's time consuming, and you're going to use more resources like soil and pots. Really great compromise to doing that potting up is using 50 cell trays. So instead of 128, there's 50 cells in the tray, and you would never have to pot them up. So you can at least have plants that are going to last longer in their trays and reduce the amount of labor. Thinning and transplanting. So let's say you seed a tray of lettuce and about 4 lettuce sprouts pop up on your tray and you only want 1. Let's say 4 lettuce sprouts popped up in the tray and the cell next to it is empty. You can pull out 3 of those sprouts and then you can transplant 1 into the cell next to it. So thinning is a very important practice because many times people just want 1 plant per cell, so that when you plant it in the ground, 1 plant grows large. A con to thinning and transplanting is the time. And some plants don't survive the transplanting. When you stick that little baby sprout into the soil, make a little divot and stick it in, sometimes they don't survive. It just depends if the roots are healthy, but young plants are really vigorous. I'd recommend trying transplanting because it can be really, really helpful and also help teach us about the resilience of plants. I could recommend racks if you are limited on space. Rack with wheels is what we use at DFI. So imagine if you have your plants indoors, you can bring your plants indoors at night. If it's frosty or cold, bring them indoors. And then during the day, you can bring them outside and let them get sunshine and that exposure. It's great for hardening off plants. The con is that when your plants are outside, they're going to dry out a lot faster. So you might have to water them 2 times, maybe 4 times in a day, depending on how windy it is and sunny. Water monitoring and moisture. Watering is a hands-on process. The best way to tell if a cell is watered is to dig into the cell yourself, pull out a plug, and see if the moisture is reaching the bottom. Don't water too much, don't water too little. Just water the plants uniformly. Pay attention to the edges of your table or where you have the plants if there's a draft, because the edges usually dry out most. They'll need a little more water. Be mindful of that draft, breeze, the sun and shade exposure, all important things to consider when you're considering water monitoring. But really just dig into the soil. Like if you need to pull a plant out, the roots are resilient, they'll be okay. Monitoring for pests and disease, really key, just like monitoring for water. When you see your plants every day, greet them, look closely at them, see your plants, make sure your plants are seen. You could sing to your plants. Look closely at the undersides of the leaves, look into the center of the plant, check out the plant's roots in the potting soil. I like to run my hand over our trays, our seeds, to see if any gnats, anything flies off of the leaves as they get touched. If the plants are strong, it's kind of nice to feel the plants. The main pests in our DFI greenhouse is fungal gnats, aphids, and mice. The main disease in our DFI greenhouse is fungal issues, damping off, and root rot, botrytis, and fusarium wilt. The main diseases can be addressed through watering, but also sometimes those diseases are brought in through potting soil, compost. They could be brought in through the seeds. So I'm happy to answer questions about pests and disease, and we'll go more into it individually with different plants later on. If you have any questions, you can refer to our DFI IPM plan, the Nevada Department of Agriculture, or any extension resources. Timing. So when we decide when to plant a seed, we're going to work backwards from the planned planting date. So the planting date is when this plant needs to be growing outside. So if the planting date is May 21st, we may start the plant 4 weeks before then. The most common veggies are ready for transplant about 3 to 5 weeks after the seed germinates. We'll transplant plants once the roots reach the bottom of the cell. So in a 128, that's usually about 4 weeks, sometimes 5 weeks when it's really grown into the cell. We talked about pests and disease. If a plant gets too root bound, it's not going to grow well. It's going to have really stressed out time. So we'll usually transplant our plants from a 128 cell to a 3-inch pot. And the nice part about this is that we're putting it into a fresh pot of soil. So it's getting a whole new round of nutrients when we're using this nutrient-rich potting mix. And then timing, another thing to consider is how many days do you want to harden your plants off to really get them ready for living outside in the harsh conditions, not the little greenhouse oasis. It's a wild outdoors, So hardening off maybe 2, 3, 4 days before planting outside. You can get them exposed to the sun in a moderate way. Outplanting is when the plants are going to be planted from greenhouse into the soil. A good trick I found with if you don't have a lot of time to harden the plants off is you can use row cover and plant the plants outside underneath row cover, and that can provide a nice protection from the sun. Oftentimes, baby plants coming from a greenhouse or home environment can get sunburnt really easily. We'll talk about some plants of interest next. Cucurbits, the cucumber family, melon family, squash, tomatoes, beans and peas, onions, brassicas, the kale, cabbage family, lettuce, and strawberries. Just a quick note is that we use the same potting mix for all of these crops and varieties except for strawberries. Cucurbits, cucumbers, squash, etc. We always use a germ chamber to start our seeds. After that, they'll come out of the germ chamber, usually uniformly germinated, and we'll put them onto the heat mat. If you're at home, the humidity dome is a good alternative. And then from there, they'll come off the heat mat once they're completely germinated. If in the summertime, I love to just direct seed cucurbits. Like I love to direct seed zucchini when it's July. You could just plant them, and in a month and a half, you're gonna have tons of zucchini harvestable into August and September, late August and September. When you're propagating cucurbits, do your best to monitor the watering closely. Really try not to overwater at first when these are baby plants. They need consistent moisture, but they don't need to be completely soaked. And that can be a big issue with fungal issues, with fungal diseases. Don't underwater when the plant matures. When they get larger, they really do guzzle water. Managing pests and disease, our main pest or disease has been fungal wilting or fusarium. We've assumed that it's come from the seeds, so we're going to treat the seeds this year, and we might inoculate our seeds with mycorrhizae to kind of add a fungal companion to hopefully create more resistance and more vitality in the plant. Another good solution is purchasing these hybrid varieties of highly disease-resistant seeds. So if you have a fusarium issue in your soil and you know that, you can purchase seeds. They're much more expensive, but they have a lot of good benefits as far as fighting off diseases and having good vigor to grow well. And then direct seeding can be a way to just skip the whole greenhouse step and go right into the soil. If you have good soil, direct seed. And then damping off, a way we combat that is just to let the cells dry out within reason. Propagating tomatoes. We always try to use the germ chamber, and then we'll bring the plants once they've started germinating onto the heat mat or humidity dome. So with the germ chamber, we take plants out when they're roughly like 50 to 75% germinated. We'll start taking them out of the germ chamber. Here's our germination guides. 86 is a good temperature for tomatoes to germinate, so pretty warm temperature. I would recommend using a reliable seed source. Don't start your tomato plants too soon because they do grow quickly. I started the dig tomatoes about 8 weeks before pickup, and they were just big. These tomatoes featured in the photo were grown about maybe 11 or 12 weeks before their pickup time, and we had to use stakes to stake them up, and they were really outgrowing their 3-inch pots. It was a ton of work to stake up all these plants. So as much as you might want tomatoes sooner, consider the time and labor that it could take to suspend these plants, hold them up. Nutrition, avoid over fertilizing, but regularly supplement your nutrients. So the tomatoes will tell you when they need nutrients. The leaves will start to show signs of yellowing, and that's a great time to use fish hydrolysate or compost to your extract. Tomato viruses can appear when the tomatoes are small, even when they're large. They could be stunted, or they could have a weird texture in the leaves. We had something like that at DFI 2 years ago, and it didn't transmit to other plants, but you do want to separate those plants out. If you have consistent tomato diseases in your soils, then a good alternative solution is to graft a disease-resistant rootstock. If you're interested in that grafting rootstock comment, you could stay tuned for a future DFI workshop on vegetable grafting. We're currently learning now. Beans and peas. I would highly recommend just direct seeding your beans and peas, but a great way to kind of get a jump start on the season is by transplanting them. I would say about 3 to 4 weeks max, so that they don't get too tall and entangled like what happened with our beans and peas for our dig group last season. I started them about 6 weeks early, and they grew like a bean. They grew fast. You can pre-soak your seeds, and that will really help with the germination happening quicker. And if the plants get stressed or rebound, they're more susceptible to disease. So less time in the greenhouse, more time outside for beans and peas. Besides that frost issue, so be mindful of that. Onions, we found a really great propagation strategy for onions. We'll seed them into 10-20 flat, so an open tray with lots of soil. So the tray is about 2 inches deep. We'll put them into the germ chamber and then onto the heat mats once they've started germinating. It's important to estimate how many seeds you need per row foot, or how many plants you need per row foot. And so I would recommend kind of doing some math here and weighing 10 seeds and seeing how many ounces that is, and then just determining how many plants you want and figure out how many seeds you want per tray. It's never hurts to overseed. So if you don't want to do math, you could just overseed a bunch and have lots and lots of extra onions. But when you're planting the onions, having that 3-inch spacing is going to allow them to size up nicely. Try to use new seeds when possible. I've heard people have had issues with onions in the past. We've had issues with old onion seed, but never had issues with new onion seed. Algae might grow on the trays because they're in the soil for so long. It's not an issue. I just try to break it up because it can make a hydrophobic soil surface, kind of wicking moisture off of the tray. Over and under watering could be an issue, so just watch closely. We might water our trays once a week sometimes. Brassicas, the kale family, cabbage, collards. We like to use a germ chamber. Heat mat and humidity dome is a possibility. The germination of these seeds decreases over time, so I've seen older kale seeds will have more sporadic germination and less vitality. I found that planting the seeds into the soil sooner can be beneficial, because as the plants grow out, become root bound, they will develop a curved stem. If that happens, it's really no problem, but you'll want to plant them as soon as possible, and also plant that curved stem into the ground. If you bury that curved stem, it should help the plant grow straighter as it matures. Huge pest with our kale is aphids. A great solution to aphids is beneficial insects. If you have kale plants in your living room and you have aphids in your kale plants, you may not want to introduce grain lacewings or ladybird beetles. You could maybe just do a knockdown spray of pyrethins, certified organic based product. That's what we use at DFI, a product called Pyganic, because sometimes there's no way to avoid the aphids are there for whatever reason, and we don't have a beneficial insect solution. Like in the wintertime when our plants are overwintering in the hoop houses, many beneficial insects can't survive, but somehow the aphids can. Damping off can be an issue, so just managing moisture, not overwatering them too much when they start. Overwatering is it's tricky to really nail it, but we just figure when we water, we want to let the trays dry out for a day or two, at least. But 2 days with a baby seed, yeah, kind of don't need to get into that too much. Fungal gnats have been an issue. They'll try to eat the organic matter, eat that peat moss and compost off the surface of the cell. And our solution for that has been having fans blowing on our trays. Managing the moisture, not having too wet of trays has helped. And then there's these yellow sticky traps that you can hang over your tray, and you can kind of try to stimulate the movement of the fungal gnats, and they should fly onto the traps and get stuck. And then mice love kale, they love lettuce. Traps, if there's live traps or snap traps, repellent, like a product like Plant Skid. It's a bovine blood, pig blood based product that repels mice. They're repulsed by the blood smell, or a physical barrier. So this is a really good solution. Just put row cover over your leafy green plants. The mice they'll just find that green and they'll eat it. Talking about green, lettuce. So lettuce is a plant that, just like spinach, I'll use ambient temperatures for germination, about 50 to 60 degrees. I'll leave them on the table. You can see this lettuce growing guide says 68 is a good temperature. So usually I'll try to put them in a sunny spot in my greenhouse, but I want to keep them off of the heat mats. I found that the germination is a little more inconsistent when they have supplemented heat. Pelleted lettuce helps for its accuracy. We'll thin our trays to 1 seed per cell so that we have big, nice heads growing. And I find just with kale too that it helps to transplant these plants sooner. So you may want to grow a big lettuce head and plant it outside, 6 weeks old. But I would recommend sticking with maybe 4 or 5 weeks when you go into transplanting, because the plants will grow more efficiently when they're young and they have time to really settle into their native soil. With those mice, we kind of just went over that with kale. It's the same thing. They'll find the green and they'll eat the leaves. Aphids, same story. Those are our 2 main pests for lettuce. Strawberries, so that was a great adventure. Thank you, David, for introducing us to strawberry propagation. It's totally feasible. Strawberry seeds are very small, kind of like thyme or rosemary seeds, similar propagation methods as well. We followed the guidance from Mike from the strawberry store to a T, and I would recommend that as a good place to start, strawberrystore.com. The heat mat and the capillary mat is the way that Mike recommended watering. So you can see we have a piece of black plastic here, and we want constant water here. The key to the bottom watering in the strawberries is having no nutrients in the soil, and I kind of touched on that, but it will prevent disease and algae from growing too extensively. It's kind of like a sterile growing environment just for the seeds to sprout. And then once the seeds sprouted, we transplanted them into a Hollytone organic acid fertilizer. Don't start your seeds too soon. We started ours about 3 weeks too early, my estimate is, from last year for the big strawberries. So I'll pass it off to Anna. We can talk about how to get involved.
Great, thank you, Tanner. So before we let loose on questions, I just wanted to share opportunities to get involved for anybody who might be interested. We do engage volunteers through our work trade program, which I mentioned earlier. So people would commit to about 4 hours a week of working with us, and they would receive around $20 worth of produce each week in return. If you're interested, you can email abunyan@unr.edu. We also offer tours and events for the public. We'll do 1 hour lunch hour tours at the end of each month. And roughly every other Saturday morning, we're having an event that might be a volunteer event, it might be a workshop or a social. And you can go to our website events page, which you could find by just Googling DFI and clicking the events link, or there's the URL right there. And finally, we do rely on gifts from the community to help us fund these opportunities for student employee positions, agricultural internships, our farm equipment needs, food security work, and the expansion of these services for Nevada growers. So if you are interested in donating, that can also be done at our website. So thank you so much for joining us, and we will pass it along for questions. So as a final note, this is our team, our faculty team, and contact information. And I think we'll open it up for questions. Thanks.
Okay. Do you hear me? This is Mary.
Yes.
Okay, very good. I have been compiling all of the questions, and just bear with me. I'm adding this last question that came in. And what I'll do is, if anyone has questions, just direct them to me, and then I will add them at the end here. Okay, let's see. The first question was from Stacy. She had some questions regarding when should start our seeds given our late frost. So any guidance on when we should be planting our plants without concern for frost? I know you said something about a row cover, and what is a row cover, Tanner?
Oh, nice. Yeah, row cover is like a agribon. It's like a cloth, it's made of a plastic base, and it can help basically if you have a low of 29 and you put a piece of row cover down, it can keep the temperature underneath that row cover, maybe 4 degrees higher than it is outside. So it's a way to protect plants supplementally. You can put multiple layers of row cover to get those effects. 2 layers of row cover could increase the temperature underneath about 4, maybe 6, 7 degrees. So it's like a mini greenhouse. As far as timing with plants, it depends on your scenario. You know, do you have a greenhouse to grow the plants large, or do you want to direct seed outside, and you can coordinate your timing with that. Typically, I'll base a lot of plants about 4 to 6 weeks before I want to transplant them, except for tomatoes. I'll plant maybe 8 weeks before, and I'll transplant them into pots and then put them outside.
So
go ahead.
What temperature are you looking at? Like above freezing or at night?
Yeah, really good question. So I asked a fellow farming friend over at Prema Farms, what's the coldest temperature you'd let your tomatoes get to at night? And all of you Tahoe gardeners are going to cringe, but he said that he would never let his tomatoes get below 50 degrees. So that's something really important to consider, is that many of these summertime plants really, really don't want any cold temperatures. The frost damage will totally stunt the plant. So it's better, I think many Tahoe growers could attest that it's better to wait until you have assurance that there's not going to be a frost incoming. But next best thing is, if you really love your plants and you don't want them to get damaged, is throw blankets over them. If you don't have row cover, you could throw blankets. You know, like literally think about how you could insulate these plants and keep them from getting damaged from harsh coldness. Take that stuff off in the morning though, once it's not freezing.
Okay, question, what kind of heat pads are you using, or more likely, what should the home grower use? There was a concern about fire hazards using indoors. How do you assure that it's not going to have a fire issue?
Yeah, good question. We use Phytotronics heat mats and thermostat and Phytotronics germ chamber. The heat mats are only warranted if you have the thermostat, so it's another $50 investment. The thermostat has a little probe, so they will kick off. I think running a heat mat is just like running a heater inside of your house, or it's like running an electric blanket. I don't think there's a lot of risk from fire hazard from the mat itself, but there could be some conductivity if the heat mat has maybe a severed electrical cord, but that's a risk with anything. We can water on top of the heat mats, and I've never found an issue with watering them. So yeah, there's other varieties of heat mats out there, but Phytotronics is definitely reliable for kind of the small scale to large scale, just to consider how many trays you want to have on the heat mat at one time.
And just a follow-up question, where do you buy these things? Online or?
Typically, I purchased heat mats from Phytotronics online. One of our parts went out on a thermostat, and they sent us a new part. They're pretty responsive.
Okay.
But directly from Phytotronics is where we purchased.
Where would someone buy potting soil was another question.
Yeah, awesome question. So if you don't want to make your own potting soil, there's lots of good potting soil products out there. Probably your local nursery would be the best place to request that. I've heard, I can't really attest that any potting mix is better or worse than the other. Besides, a certified organic potting mix is going to have more better source ingredients.
Okay. Has anyone found a good pen for labeling that doesn't fade?
We use Sharpies. Those work well.
I would add that sometimes Sharpies, if it's out in the yard, they do fade, but a pen that I have found is the Milwaukee Inkzol. I don't know if you know of that one. It's like a Sharpie, but it seems to last longer.
We typically don't leave our labels on the plants after we've transplanted them. We'll basically keep a map of the plants. But yeah, the Milwaukee could be a great solution if you have stakes outside to label the plants when they're in the ground.
Okay, let's see. One more question. I think we answered it. When is the right time for the first plants to be put in the ground at Lake Tahoe? The frost is always an issue.
Yeah, that's a good question.
And
I'm in the valley, so I can't really address when the last frost in Tahoe is. But
yes.
that's is nice about having a gardening group and community garden, because you know you guys can really hone in on that and look out for each other.
Okay, let's see, a question. How do you get rid of hornworm larvae in soil in the winter?
That's a good question. I'm a big advocate of biology. I've talked to the people at RBCO Organics, and they've talked about introducing beneficial nematodes, and those nematodes can basically carnivore. They'll eat larvae. They'll parasitize larvae. So beneficial insects from RBCO could be a good solution, but they're active in warmer soils, so it would be something that you'd want to introduce to your soils now in the spring or summer to have those benefits over winter.
Okay. Question is peat sustainable?
Peat is not sustainable. We are well aware that peat is not a sustainable potting mix product. It's so effective. Peat comes from peat bogs, and I don't have to get into it, but it hurts my heart that we use peat moss. I wouldn't recommend it, but it's a really good growing medium. So we're kind of in between transitioning out of peat moss.
Okay.
Caught in the midst of needing to produce a lot of healthy plants and not quite ready to experiment with other alternatives.
Okay, I have one question here. Is that Arabico, ARBICO Organics?
Yes, Arabico Organics. They're awesome. If you have pest or disease, just check out their website, give them a call. They will really, really help you nip it in the with beneficials. They always recommend beneficial insects before anything else.
Okay, one question. Will this presentation be sent out? We will post the presentation on the Lake Tahoe Master Gardener YouTube channel, and I believe they may be on the DFI website. I think we're trying to post it there, and then or at least make it accessible to you. And Turk and Slow Food Lake Tahoe will also have access. So let's see, Pete, this is another question. I think it's the same one. Is peat moss sustainable? That's Pete, right? That's what.
Yep, we heard that one.
Yeah. Are there any local soil labs that folks can use?
Yeah, great question. We use De La Valley for our soil testing. There are soil labs. I think UNR has a soil testing facility, but we have had our previous director had great experience with De La Valley, reliable. So we've continued to use De La Valley. It really is like once you start collecting data, you want to make sure you can keep that data consistent with the same type of testing methods. So I hope there's more local places to test. You can test for biology in your soil. You can test for that fungal to bacterial ratio. You can test for the biological activity. You can test soil chemistry. There's lots of ways. It's great to test.
Okay, there is a question about how do you spell the name De La Valley?
Yeah.
If you,
I
you
can
put it in the chat.
I can go ahead and send that in the chat to everyone. I feel like I have to write it out before I can. So it'll be DELLA VALLE. And I am sending that in the chat.
Oh, there it is. Okay, very good. Okay, there are no additional questions coming in. This is your last chance. So I think we can turn it back to Anne.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Anna and Tanner, so much for that wonderful presentation. It seems like the Desert Farming Initiative is doing a lot of really, really wonderful work. And we're definitely excited to have you all providing many of our starts as well. I'm going to steal back the screen share. If anyone has questions that didn't get answered during the presentation or that comes up as they're trying to address or test out any of their seed starting or transplanting themselves, don't hesitate to reach out to Anna and Tanner. I'll put their contact information in the chat to everyone as well. And then, as we had mentioned at the beginning of the workshop, we do have a ton of workshops for you all this season. The workshops themselves, all of our virtual presentations and those workshop Saturdays are free. If you want starter plants, each of those starter plants are $15, and you can register to purchase those through the Slow Food Lake Tahoe website, linked up there, as well as that I just put in the chat. But thank you all so much for joining us this evening. We hope that you learned a lot from our wonderful presenters, and we look forward to seeing you in the beginning of April to learn about fungi.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Anne. Mary, you want to turn off the recording?